Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Victor Gao, a Vice President of CCG. I'm very happy to host the CCG VIP Luncheon today. As you may know, Henry and Mabel attended the Aspen conference in the United States, and he asked me to convey their personal greetings to all of you. And we are gathered here in a very important meeting today, because we know that the third plenum just concluded, and the United States presidential election has generated huge amount of curiosity and concern throughout the world. And the foreign minister of Ukraine is in Beijing right now for very important discussions with the Chinese leaders. And we may know more in a matter of 1 or 2 days as to what China and Ukraine have been talking about peace or ceasefire or negotiation or how to end the war in Ukraine. And we were all very delighted that China actually brokered this very important meeting with more than a dozen Palestinian factions and leaders in Beijing, issuing the Beijing Declaration. And this is really unprecedented because it's very difficult to line up all the different factions among the Palestinians, the Fatah, the Hamas, you name it. But they are all here in Beijing in a very important meeting chaired by the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. And I think that again demonstrated the Chinese way of ingenuity and diplomatic breakthrough. So I think our meeting, our gathering today cannot be more important and more timely. Further, we have invited two of the best speakers and the top brains in China for China's development policy, China's engagement with the rest of the world, China and WTO, etc. Professor Yiping Huang of Peking University and Professor Xinchuan Tu of the UIBE. So we are all very interested in listening to what these two distinguished speakers will share with us, their assessment of the third plenum, their views about so many important things in the world and in China. And we also have about 11 ambassadors and deputy chief of mission, senior diplomats from many other embassies, altogether more than 20 embassies in China, and many international organizations. And before I go over the list very quickly, may I also bring to our attention the presence of Mr. Amit Shivak, who is the CEO of ETS, who traveled all the way from Washington, D.C. to Beijing, and without exaggerating a little bit, just to attend the CCG VIP Luncheon. So, Amit, a good friend of ours, and allow me also to mention that many of us, including me, took tests under the ETS umbrella. I took TOEFL, I took test of GRE, and I also took LSAT test, etc. So in a sense, we all have this connection with the ETS services, and ETS's China CEO is also here. Where is the lady? Yes, please. Yes. So we are very happy, and this visit also demonstrates that connections between China and the United States are not broken. We continue to have all these important US delegations coming, and just the other day, a group of very important American companies came to visit China and held very important discussions. So I think decoupling is really a myth. De-risking is probably exaggeration. Decoupling China and the United States is like decoupling the Earth from the moon. You never want to do that. And if you are successful in that, you generate greater disasters. And de-risking is also a myth, because risks are everywhere. And risks are not to be de-risked. Risks are to be managed. So, with your permission, I will go over this very quickly as a recognition of their special importance to us. We have among this distinguished body of VIPs, His Excellency Bruno Angelet, Ambassador of Belgium to China. And then we also have His Excellency John Busuttil, Ambassador of Malta to China, and His Excellency Scott Dewar, Ambassador of Australia to China, and His Excellency Hannes Hansel, Ambassador of Estonia to China, His Excellency Hallam Henry, Ambassador of Barbados to China, His Excellency Tori Ibsen, Ambassador of Iceland to China, and His Excellency James Kimonio, Ambassador of Rwanda to China, and His Excellency Jan Marshall, Ambassador of Grenada to China, yes, and His Excellency Dario Mihelin, Ambassador of Croatia to China, and His Excellency Ismail Haki Musa, Ambassador of Turkey to China, yes, Ambassador, and His Excellency Marcelo Suarez Salvia, Ambassador of Argentina to China. So we have all these very distinguished ambassadors, extraordinary and plenipotentiary, as well as senior diplomats from many embassies in China, and CCG really takes great pride in having become a major platform for gatherings with the ambassadors, with the chief of mission in many ambassadors here in China, with the Chinese side of the equation. So please join me in give a clap to the presence of the ambassadors and senior diplomats of many embassies here in China for the CCG VIP Luncheon. Allow me to very briefly talk about the two speakers today. Professor Huang Yiping of Beijing University, OER Distinguished Professor, Dean of the National School of Development, and Director of the Institute of Digital Finance. I've attended many meetings with Professor Huang as the keynote speaker. I would say if I have any insight about the Chinese way of doing things, it's all coming from Professor Huang Yiping. And we also have Professor Xinquan Tu, who is the Dean and Professor and WTO Chairholder at the China Institute for the WTO Studies of UIDE. Professor Tu, please stand up so we can give you applause. Before they start their keynote speeches, allow me to mention one thing as a starter leading to their keynote speeches. One is that we are really living in a very turbulent world, and mankind is on the verge of a turning point, either towards peace or towards war. And China does not want to have war. China really wants to have peace with all countries. Now further, here in China, if you really follow the events of the Third Plenum, then we will all ask, what exactly does this Third Plenum mean? It's very philosophical as far as I can understand. I've made many comments about it. It's like a PhD dissertation, for example. And you really need to use a lot of bandwidth to fully understand what does the Third Plenum mean, what does this new qualitative productivity mean, what will be the turning point going forward in China for the economic development, etc. But we are very happy, we are very fortunate to have the two speakers. Therefore, please join me in warmly welcome Professor Huang Yiping, a real authority on China's national development. Thank you very much, Professor Huang. We are all ears.
Thank you, Victor, for your very kind introduction. I cannot claim myself as an authority on national development. I do a little bit of work in finance, but also macroeconomy is one of the issues we always pay attention to. So I'd like just to make a few points in relation to the third plenary, and then we can probably start from there. The first point, you probably all saw the Asian market dropped after the third plenary, especially after the whole document was out. And so some people felt a little bit pessimistic. My own sense, my take, is that the market was probably too optimistic about what they should expect. In fact, if you were paying attention to what the president himself was saying and the government officials trying to convey the messages trying to convey to the public, it was pretty clear this would not be a grand-scale liberalization program. This will be about reform, about modernization, but the key approach the president outlined himself very clearly. He called running towards the problems and trying to correct them. So it's more like a down-to-earth and a very practical approach. When you're trying to see the problems, you're trying to overcome it. I personally, obviously, would have recommended more radical approaches if I had the chance, and I actually did on some occasions. But I think this, realistically speaking, what you should expect from the third plenum. Number one, the Chinese reform approach was never really radical approach or big bang approach. In fact, as economists, we spent decades debating with each other whether the former Soviet Union's big bang approach was better or the Chinese gradualism approach was better. Not to mention which is better, you just think any kind of reform program you adopt need to meet one requirement. That is social, economic, and political feasibility. So I would say to expect that now China is turning suddenly very radical and a big bang approach. It might at some stage, but this was number one, not the traditional approach of Chinese reform. Number two, even if you were thinking about turning to more radical approach, this is probably not the best time. Given the domestic problems we're facing, inequality problems, financial risks, and so on, you need to be careful when you liberalize. According to the policy document, there are lots of market failure problems in addition to government failure problems. So that's why you will want to be careful. The second reason, and I'm sure you all know, that geopolitical tension certainly would make it much more difficult when you liberalize. It doesn't mean you don't liberalize, but you liberalize, you need to be careful. I can share you one of my own experience that is related to the financial sector. In the National Financial Work Conference held in 2017, there was one particular article saying, we're going to steadily push forward capital account liberalization. You all know, I'm sure, that diplomats all understand the capital account liberalization, right? Meaning capital can move in and out freely. That was our long-term goal, and that policy was specifically written in the policy document in 2017, the National Financial Work Conference. The Central Financial Work Conference last year didn't mention capital account liberalization. It still said we're going to liberalize, open up, but it also mentioned about the importance of the national security issues in economic and financial areas. Therefore, it actually emphasized on attracting foreign financial institutions to China and attracting long-term capital to China. Why there was a shift? And I think you probably would understand when you open the capital account, the good thing is there is a chance that you can improve the efficiency of financial resource allocation. But it also brings the problem, very volatile capital outflow and inflow. Only if you have a strong financial system, you can withstand the kind of dramatic capital inflow and outflow. Many developing countries, in fact, did not have the capability. So after they liberalize the capital accounts, you end up quickly with a financial crisis. That's what happened in many countries during the Asian financial crisis, during like 25 years or so ago. I was appointed by Christine Lagarde, then the managing director of IMF, in 2018 as a member of the external advisory group for surveillance. I'm not sure if you heard about surveillance. IMF sent its people to member countries every year to review their economic and financial policy framework and then would make recommendations. One policy recommendation they always recommended to developing countries that you should open up the capital account. I thought that was a wrong policy prescription. It really depends on whether you are ready or not. If you're not ready, you probably should not liberalize it. So in fact, during my 3 years tenure as an external advisor to IMF for the reviewing process, my most important recommendation is don't force developing countries to liberalize the capital account. In fact, if they are facing great financial risks or risks of financial crisis, you should encourage them to introduce some restrictions on capital account and capital flows. So this just, IMF actually to some extent adopted that recommendation. So what I'm saying is the reforms need to go forward, no question. But you only want to do it prudently. And I think the approach the government took, number one, was very much in line with what I actually expected. And number two, I thought that was a realistic approach. Even if you have more aggressive idea, as I said, personally, I would like to recommend some more aggressive measures, but perhaps this is not the best time for us to expect it. That's the overall approach. So when you say, well, the market is disappointed, that's probably true. But either because the expectation was just overly too high. Or number two, I think the reason why investors are not very upbeat at the moment is because the macroeconomy is not doing particularly well. You saw the number. The GDP growth was 5.3% during the first quarter, and it came down to 4.7% during the second quarter. That was a problem. And I think what the government should do, and I hope they will do more, is to adopt a much more aggressive stimulus package to boost the economic activity and boost the sentiment. So that's my first point. The second point is what were the key emphasis in my view. I think we should look at when the president said, well, we're running towards the problem and correcting it, trying to correct it. The question is, what are the key problems we're facing? If you read the policy document, there's 300 policy items that they're going to be implemented. So this is a very complicated story. But as an economist, for me, what are the two most important economic challenges that we're facing? I think there are two issues. Number one, how do we sustain economic growth? We used to do very well when our cost base was very low and we export a lot of labor-intensive manufacturing products and the growth was particularly strong. But the labor cost or the GDP per capita increased from about $200 when we started economic reform, and now we are at the doorstep of the threshold of high-income economy. Income levels increased dramatically. The other side of the coin is your cost base is also very high now. So you can't just repeat what you were doing in the past. You needed to do new things to remain competitive and to sustain growth. But for us economists, the key indicator is what we call the total factor productivity. You needed to improve efficiency. How do we improve efficiency? The government said, well, they coined this new term called the new quality productive force. What is it? I don't know exactly, but I think it's about some new scientific research and innovation-driven new economic activities, business models, products, and so on. At the same time, if we can do better in the traditional industries, like industries, agriculture, and so on. So we use the term total factor productivity. This is the key. But what behind the rise in total factor productivity is innovation. Innovation could be like a global cutting-edge frontier technology, but it also could be just whatever we're doing and we do it better. Even if you're cutting somebody's hair, you can do it more efficiently and with high-quality product. That's better. That's also good. So these are the things the government is trying to focus on. That's why there are a number of measures. They're trying to focus on what we can do to promote research and development. And there's a long item. How do we foster the growth of the talents? That's another, including the universities. That's a big job. What is also important, I think, there was a very clear, or at least a clear division of labor between the SOEs and the private enterprises. And this is the one which I think is very important. Because for innovation, the private sector contributes something like more than 70% of the Chinese patents. So at the end of the day, the question about whether or not you can innovate really depends on whether the private sector can do the job. And what I saw was hopeful in the policy document was the government said they're going to grant all the kind of opportunities to the private sector, including equal entry standards, including giving the private enterprises the opportunity to participate and even lead key scientific research projects, and a number of others. So I thought that was very good. At the same time, the document also said that the SOEs, while obviously they're going to become more important in the Chinese economy, and I must say the foreign press focused on one specific term. The government said they're going to make the state sector bigger and stronger. But what I think was even more important was they said the state capital should concentrate in 3 key areas. Number one is related to national security and the stability of the national economy. Number two is more related to the public utility, supporting the welfare, stability of the economy, and so on. This is more like a public service. And number three is more on leading innovative areas like new technology and so on. I'm not 100% confident that the state sector will do very well in terms of innovation, discovering new products. But I think that in terms of maintaining the stability of the economy and providing public service like the transportation, the railways, the bus, and so on, these are the ones the state capital should focus on. I think this is no different from any other market economies. That I thought was very good. That clear division of labor, in fact, makes clear that what the SOEs should focus on going forward. And at the same time, it also identifies the areas where the private enterprises can play bigger roles. So that was on innovation. I thought it was pretty clear. The second issue, which is also very important, economic issue, is about consumption. Consumption is very low. compared to world average. Consumption share of GDP in China is 55%. So only a bit over half of the GDP was spent on consumption. That was 20 percentage points below the global average. And so we always say, well, consumption is very weak in China. Weak consumption causes two problems. Number one is you obviously will easily end up in domestic overcapacity problem, right? You produce a lot, you invest a lot, and then the final consumption demand is very weak. That means there will be a certain portion of the capacity you cannot find the domestic buyers, and you call it overcapacity. And that's why during the last 45, 46 years of Chinese reform, we almost always had the overcapacity problem. NDRC, now they stopped doing it, but before, every year NDRC will tell people these are the areas you should try to avoid because there's an overcapacity risk. So for instance, the labor-intensive manufacturing products, the white goods, the steel, cement, aluminum, and so on. There's a long list, and now we're talking about the new green energy products, and they always. I think that the macroeconomic problem is there is a macro imbalance. Consumption and the demand and the supply are not very balanced. So that is one big issue. Now, when China was small, you couldn't actually export out of the problem. When we have overcapacity, we just export it, and then there's no big issue. Now it's becoming a big issue because you're already a large country economy. If you want to repeat the same strategy, there will be big problems going forward. In fact, before we start exporting lots of EVs to the US, we exported 1.2 million EV units to the US. To the global market. Last year we exported 10,000 EVs to the US. But when Janet Yellen, Secretary Yellen visited our school in April, the first thing she said was your overcapacity in the EV sector is going to destroy our automobile industry and affect our employment situation. Now that might be true in terms of the long-term expectation. If China continues massively, if the exports continue to grow massively. But when I said, well, China only exported 10,000 units of the EVs to the US, do you really think that's having a big impact on the US market and the industry? That's another issue. But what I'm saying is the reaction function of the world market is already very different. So that's why you need to be careful. But the second question, which the policymakers also pay close attention to, is if consumption is weak, then that means your development is not benefiting the ordinary people. You're saving lots of money, their living standard is not rising as quickly as they should be, right? And the reason why consumption is weak, there are many issues, hurdles. I can give you, for instance, 4 important reasons. Number one is obviously income share of the household in total national income is still too low. In other words, the SOEs, the government is still capturing too much income. And to give you one example, you probably heard one of the main revenue sources for the local government is selling land, right? That is one of the biggest distortions in the Chinese economy. The local government could sell land and get revenue and do whatever they could do. But that's not fair, because land doesn't belong to the local government. It should belong to all people in China. If somebody sells land, the income should be distributed, but it was not. So that's just one example, and I think we need to redistribute income. Therefore, the households can capture more income. I'm going to stop very quickly. The second reason is that income distribution is very unequal. So rich people have very low propensity to consume, and the poor people have a very high propensity to consume. But income distribution is so unequal, therefore you're going to see very weak aggregate demand. The third reason is the underdeveloped social welfare system. So that's why people worry if a household get income, they don't spend all the money. They put the money into the banks. That just means the social protection is not good enough. And finally, urbanization. Migrant workers working in the cities for 10, 20, 30 years, they still don't get the household registration. And so they don't enjoy the same kind of the social welfare benefit. And that's why their spending is constrained, because they needed to go back home to build their houses in the village and supporting their family back home. My guess is that I don't think they would ever live in that house in their own village. You have been living in the cities for 40 years. After retirement, are you really going to go back and live there? Because you would know nobody there. So these are the things the government is now trying to resolve. Income distribution is one big issue that they're called the primary round of distribution, secondary round of redistribution, and the third round of the redistribution. In fact, one key area the policy focused on is to grant people, whoever is living in the cities with this long-term residency, should enjoy the kind of social benefit. There was a study by CAS, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. They found a migrant worker who's living in the cities, if you tell him, from today you will have the urban residency, even without enjoying the benefit, the social benefit, his or her consumption spending increased by 36%. The reason is because their expectations changed. So these are the things I think the policy is trying to deal with. And personally, as I said, my take was the document itself, the overall content was very much in line with my expectation. And number two, I think these measures were very practical. And these are the problems we needed to resolve. But the market was not upbeat yet, and I mentioned about the macroeconomic condition. But the other challenge, which I cannot answer at the moment, is that whether or not all these will be rigorously implemented. And that remains to be seen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Huang. I think he touched upon many important points of great concern to all of us. And we will raise questions for the two panelists together after Professor Tu completes his speech. But before I give the floor to Professor Tu, allow me to mention one point which Professor Huang mentioned. That's the overcapacity issue, especially in the EV car. Allow me to say that from the Chinese perspective, China really believes that EV car is the technology of the future, and the fuel car is the technology of the past. Now, not everyone, not every country agrees on that, but actually China pushes forward with the EV car as a demonstration of its dedication and devotion to dealing with the climate change impact. So you can see lots of reasons why China really is single-handedly creating this EV market en masse. And as Professor Huang mentioned, China was the largest exporter of automobiles of all kinds, 2023, but the largest EV exporter. And when we listen to what Donald Trump had to say, etc., terminating all the EV subsidies in the United States if he is elected president, allow me to share with you very briefly one observation of mine. I think the US is on the wrong strategy, because if the United States wants to make sure that its automobile is sustainable, they need to make that leap of faith from fuel car to the EV car. Because otherwise, fuel car eventually will be another Kodak. It will go bankrupt eventually. And EV car can be integrated seamlessly with not only digital technology, but with AI going forward. So you are talking about two completely different ways of achieving mobility together with all the other AI applications together. So I think China and the United States really need to sit down and talk, because it's not a zero-sum game. China can really work together with the United States to make sure that the United States will make that leap of faith, because if they are stuck with the fuel car industry, eventually, my personal forecast is that it will eventually die out. But that's a decision for the Americans to make. In China, I think there is no overcapacity for EV cars, because EV car in 2023 is less than 30%, and China's goal is to increase that to 50%, 75%, and all the way up to 100%. Globally, if you look at the EV car production as a percentage of the total automobile production, it's even smaller a percentage. So where is the overcapacity? I think the fear of EV car overcapacity is a revealing indication that they are stuck with their fuel car, and continuing to embrace the fuel car industry, fuel car technology, will make it a second Kodak. That's the best of my forecast. So allow me to give the floor to Mr. Tu, and I think you probably will focus on China's foreign trade, WTO, China and the rest of the world, etc. Thank you very much, Professor Tu.
Thanks for the invitation of CCG to let me have this opportunity to meet with all the friends from all over the world, actually. And Professor Huang has had a very wonderful explanation of the new Third Plenary decision. Actually, Professor Huang and I come from the same province, the most marketized and open province in China, Zhejiang province. So I think the CCG made the right choice to invite us to explain the new reform agenda of China. But as Professor Huang has talked a lot, actually I have only a few observations and understandings to add. My first general impression on the decision is that it insists and persists the direction of marketization and liberalization of economic reform, as shown in the last over 4 decades. So I appreciate its persistency and continuity very much. There were some concerns and suspicions about that, given the current internal and external circumstances. Some even said that the era of reform is over. Now the decision has made it clear that reform and opening up is still what it meant before. I don't think that China has another choice but to continue the path of market economy. The Chinese people have enjoyed the huge benefits of freer economy and society and want to give it them up. Secondly, I noticed an interesting change or important omission comparing this decision to that of 2013, the third plan of the 18th Party Congress. In the 2013 decision, the basic economic system with public ownership playing a dominant role is considered an important pillar of the socialistic system with Chinese characteristics and the foundation of the socialist market economy. But in the new decision, the dominant role of public ownership is not mentioned. For the first time, as I know, in those important party documents. But this omission must be intentional and meaningful. Another thing is also absent, which is mixed ownership. We know that mixed ownership was designed to enhance the cooperation between SOEs and private companies, but in practice often turn out to be enhancing the way of SOEs to merge private companies. So in my opinion, the fundamental issue in the Chinese economic and even political reform is the ownership problem. If the government always emphasizes that the public ownership should take the dominance, the private sector, including foreign companies, want to be able to compete in a truly fair and equal way. And the market economy mechanism want to be feasible. So I would say this intentional omission is a great step forward. Of course, I wish in the future or the planned law on promotion of private sector could have even more clarity about the equality between different ownerships. The third important impression of mine is emphasis on the unified national market. You know, China is a huge and a diverse country. The relationship, actually the struggle between the central and the local governments has been a permanent and difficult issue in the whole Chinese history. I believe the market economy mechanism could be the best instrument to unify the country, because market economy in nature tends to expand beyond the borders and integrate into a single one through the law of one price. While local governments often want to create a fragmented and protected market, the central government could use the unified national market to break down the barriers. Given the increasingly unfriendly and hostile external environment, the unified large domestic market would be an even more important leverage against possible risks. Besides, there have been a lot of disputes about China's industrial policy, in which local governments actually play a very important role, as also mentioned by Huang about the so-called overcapacity issue. Local governments often take all available measures to compete with each other, not to compete with the rest of the world, often. Sometimes ignoring international rules and creating overinvestment and overproduction, because the market is fragmented. Therefore, a unified national market will also limit the discretion of local governments and promote fairer competition among market players, including foreign companies. And the decision explicitly declares to regulate the investment incentives of local governments and prohibits illegal preferential policies. I believe this would help to restrict unfair and excessive domestic and international competition. The fourth keyword I would like to mention is 活力, dynamism. To be honest, as an academic person, in the last almost a decade, what I'm very unhappy with is there have been too many restrictions and control over the society and the economy, including academic behavior. And even the government itself, too much control, too many requirements and too many restrictions. The government is taking too many rights as well as responsibilities, leaving smaller space to the society. The COVID-19 pandemic control made it even worse. Of course, in such a huge society as China, order and stability is very critical. But too much control kills social and economic dynamism. To some extent, it has harmed economic growth in China in the last decade. Fortunately, I believe the leadership has noticed it. As I calculate, the word dynamism, 活力, appears 5 times in the document. I think this is very special. I didn't notice it before. So I hope that the government could be more tolerant of certain deviations. It is too costly to eliminate all risks. And fifthly, I will touch upon the part about opening up. since the decision is mainly about institutional reform, there are only a few paragraphs talking about opening up. But as usual, the decision still presents a strong determination to promote further liberalization. I also argue that while there is still space for more market access, China's opening up should be more focused on the coherence of domestic institutions with other countries, especially with those advanced countries, which is phrased as institutional opening up, 制度型开放, is a very Chinese characteristic phrase in Chinese policy documents. The decision has a clearer description about what is institutional opening up or institutional openness. By stating that China will pursue compatibility and interoperability with international norms in the areas such as property protection, industrial subsidies, environmental standards, labor protection, government procurement, electronic commerce, and financial services, which are those important issues often mentioned by foreign companies and foreign governments. And also in the recent years, the Chinese government also has been claiming repeatedly that we should follow the advanced international rules in these areas. So I think China has shown its strong willingness to seek more commonalities with other market economies. Of course, always we have our own Chinese characteristics, but in terms of the economic system, I think we should seek more commonalities. More mutual communications, like today's event, are needed to make it happen. Here, I would also like to defend China in terms of WTO compliance. Actually, I just attended the ninth trade policy review on China just a week ago in the WTO. Actually, most remarks made by members are positive. Actually, only one single member has very negative comments on China's trade policy, which is in the United States, as you all know. I will not say that China has been perfect, since China is the third largest respondent in WTO dispute settlement mechanism. And also, otherwise, if we are already perfect, we don't need to reform and open up anymore. But it is absolutely not China breaking down the rules-based international trading system. China at the most is trying to make use of or dodging some WTO rules to its own benefits or to its own understanding. But right now, the United States is really disregarding the WTO rules. So as I said, China is not perfect in its economic system, and we need more reforms and openness. And everyone could criticize China for its certain policies and problems. But the United States should not pretend to be a defender of international rules while it is dismantling the whole international system. So in general, I'm very positive about the new decision and the future of the Chinese economic reforms. But as all you know, Chinese policy documents often tend to display policy goals rather than policy tools. The decision has told us where we should go, but not so clearly about how we can go there. So we still need to keep close eyes on what concrete measures will be made by relevant authorities to achieve those goals listed in the decision. So I think I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Tu. I think his comments about members of the WTO commenting about China and the US delegates' comments about China is also very interesting, very entertaining in a sense. Allow me to open up the floor for Q&A, and I would not be surprised if many of us have all kinds of questions. So we have more or less about 1 hour for the Q&A. It's an extended Q&A session. And I would say all questions will be welcome. And before I open the floor for all the other members, since Mr. Avid Sivak of ETS traveled the longest distance from Washington, D.C. all the way to Beijing, to meet with all of us and attend the CCG VIP lunch. May I give the mic to you first, and you will be the first to ask a question. And because Mr. Huang will need to leave earlier, so may I suggest we first raise more questions for Mr. Wang than Mr. Tu, and then when Mr. Wang needs to be excused, we focus all the questions on Mr. Tu. Thank you. So, Avid, you have the first question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor Gao. It's an honor for me to be here today. I'll stand up, it might be easier.
Thank you.
I want to just share very briefly that the conversation we just heard was a fantastic and inspiring reflection on the insights coming out of the Third Plenum. I had the opportunity to begin to try to, as an American coming just after the Third Plenum, it's a very interesting time for interpreting and understanding what do some of these reform agenda topics really mean. What do these 300 particular policy areas actually mean? And how do US-based organizations that are looking to invest in China, looking to expand in China, looking to serve, how do we interpret? And so the question I would love to ask Professor Huang is really, what is the perspective that he may have on how an American organization ought to interpret it? This might give us some insights and some thoughts to take back home.
Well, I think the global environment is changing. This is the basic conditions within which we should operate. As the policy, as the plenum reinforced the point that we're still open and welcome, very much welcome the foreign investment. In fact, last year, I think NDRC or another entity issued a specific policy toward foreign investor firms, and I read it. I thought it was very good, in fact, the policy. But the sentiment, the confidence is still not particularly high. And I suspect that there are two issues we should keep in mind. And I honestly think the government wants to welcome foreign companies to come to China. Because as I said, in order to continue to grow, we face lots of challenges, including the productivity growth. That's one very big issue. So there are two issues I think we need to keep in mind. Number one is as the economy moves into the high level of development, the government is probably, the policy is probably become more selective in terms of what kind of the industries and companies are more welcome here. So at one stage, for instance, there were lots of heavy industry investors, and that's probably those days are already over. And I think it will be very important to recognize whatever can support, number one, the new productive force, new quality productive force will still be very much welcome. And then number two, whatever can help to lift the living standard of the people, these would also be very welcome. So there is kind of a selection of the industries. The second issue is about national security concern. Now, like the US, which has the small yards and high fences, I think you see the same stories here in terms of, for instance, data, information. I do see there are some changes over time. So it is becoming a little bit more tricky, but I guess the most important point to recognize is that the growth model is very different now, and you need to be more selective.
Okay, just as a follow-up question, in the 300 policy areas, I had the opportunity to converse with some of the U.S. companies that were part of the U.S.-China Business Council delegation.
Yeah.
Companies from Boeing,
Yes.
Apple, from FedEx, Micron, and others.
Yes.
And there were 3 areas where I'd love to maybe ask a follow-up about your specific views on. One is this consistent message around treating foreign companies and domestic companies, including SOEs, on an even playing field.
Yes.
A second is around encouraging R&D in China.
Yeah.
And then the third is on a commitment to reduce the negative list items from 100 sectors to 30 or so.
Right.
These are 3 particular ones that many of the foreign companies and organizations that are interpreting the results of the third plenum are particularly focused on, because those are the key ones. You
Yeah.
had closed your remarks by saying that strategy and implementation can often be, it can often have a gap. In your view, if I may ask just this follow-up question of how in those particular areas do you see, how would a American, or for that matter, since there are many ambassadors and representatives here, how would global investors interpret those areas that suggest an openness, but any sense of how we think about the likelihood of those being the key part of the next few years' implementation?
Well, my sense is that they put it down on official policy document, then that certainly means they're serious. And I think they also recognize the continued Chinese economic growth really requires active participation of foreign invested companies in China. Nobody, even a country like China, can do the job all on its own. And I think that is very widely recognized. But then when you say, well, for instance, the national treatment, the negative list and so on, I think I expect that there will be some progress going forward. But one, as I mentioned, whether or not that involves national security or other concerns, if there is a concern, then we should be very careful about over-expectation. But the second, and this is a closed-door dialogue, right? So I can tell you, when we hear about national treatment, the equal treatment for private enterprises and the state-owned enterprises, I think the policy is clear. But we expect 100% equal treatment of private enterprises and the state-owned enterprises. I think we should be realistic enough. When a government official sees a state-owned enterprises and a private-owned enterprises, they won't be 100% equal. That's something we should just be very, very, very clear. But this is why also I thought, I mentioned earlier, identifying some key areas where the SOEs should concentrate their efforts actually is a very big help. when you see private enterprises, they're actually gaining more areas to operate. And these are areas where they're going to see less discrimination. Just give you one example. You probably heard that the private enterprises are having difficulties in getting financial support. And so I spoke to lots of government officials and the banks. The banks, in fact, told me that they don't discriminate against the private-owned enterprises. And so I said, well, why are you not lending as much to the private-owned enterprise? And the bank executive said, well, I have to do credit risk management. If I lend 1 million yuan to an SOE and to a private-owned enterprise, guess what? If the money to the SOE, like the project, failed, what you should expect is somebody in the government will support the SOE and the merger acquisition, injecting assets and so on. Chances are that they will repay the loan later. If you lend 1 million to a private-owned company, and if it fails, you just will lose the money. So just give you an example, and I think that I think that policy that is serious, and we should expect making some progresses. But to think that the treatment will be 100% equal, it will take time. I'm not saying the policies are not serious, but there will be areas where the implementation will take some time.
Thank you very much. And yes, I'm asking. You have a mic. Thank you.
Thank you so much. First and foremost, thanks so much to GCC for inviting myself, and I'm representing my representative on Sandish Sensitive Meetings. I'm Usha Mishra, Chief of Social Policy. I was very heartened, I must say, to hear about three things in your speech. Inequality, the issues facing migrant workers or labor, and third, most importantly, was social protection. So, just to comment first on the migrants, yes, if they get, for example, the huku, residence permit, expectations will go up and consumption will go up. But they're also facing a number of other challenges. For example, they don't have the right housing, they're not able to bring the family together. So many more, it's multi-layered. On social protection, I've got a question. What do you think is the next frontier for social welfare or social protection for China? Where do you think the gaps are in terms of prioritization? And one final comment, I didn't hear much about demographic shift, which is one of the key challenges that China is facing right now.
Well, I mean, I'm not an expert on the social welfare system, so I don't exactly know where they're going to start. But if the idea is that if you're living in the cities for some time, you kind of get what they call the 常住户口. It's kind of it's a little bit like a permanent resident in some countries, but you do not yet have the citizenship. The policy is now that for these permanent residents, they should enjoy the same kind of social welfare protection. Because you mentioned the housing, which I don't know, to be honest, because even for people with household registration may not have a free housing anymore, so you have to buy or rent yourself. But social welfare system is more about your kids' right to schooling in the cities, medical cares, and other pensions and so on. These are the ones they're going to rule out going forward. What was your last point?
We didn't hear much about demographic shift.
Oh, okay. Demographics is a very important point, and I think this is the biggest challenge we're facing. However, I think that there are two issues. One is about the shortage of labor supply, because aging means there will be a decline of labor force, like what happened in Japan. I actually think that it's relatively easier for China to deal with the problem. Did you stay like in hotels where they use simple robots to deliver the stuff to you? That is happening in many places. So I think robots and AI actually offer an opportunity for China to mitigate the labor supply problem. But on the elderly care, medical care, social protection, and so on, these challenges will continue to remain very difficult.
Yeah, thank you. I understand Ambassador Angeletta of Belgium has a question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much to CCG for a wonderful occasion. And there's a nice division of labor between Professor 1 and Professor 2, because Professor 1 means the first one and Professor 2 means the second one who moved for questions. So for Professor 1, thank you very much for so candidly describing the context, the perceptions and your analysis. On perceptions, I think what struck me was that everyone was focused on the communique, which was available at the end of the week. And that made headlines, and people focused less on the resolution that came out the weekend.
Yes.
And there is a difference between the communique and resolution for sure. And I think it's very good also that we ask us the question, what is actually new, and what are the points that are not highlighted by the observers, the experts, internationally and nationally. And you did very well. First you said there is an issue of overcapacity, it's always been there, but as long as China was not a global power, the overcapacity was not a global problem. And now it is a global problem because China is leading in the global economy. And then he said overcapacity because there's a problem of consumption. And that is very interesting. You gave the different reasons. So it's very useful that you explain that. And as the lady just said, you said social security and of course demography. And then you said the hukou, because it strikes me that no one has focused on the language in the resolution of the hukou. Because there's a little sentence saying the state will suppress or reduce or take away restrictions on Chinese citizens working in a place elsewhere than their residence. So that's typically the hukou system.
Yeah.
And I was asking a few experts, but that sounds really great. But then I was told this, but you know, it's been in many texts before, and actually, there is already a change in the hukou system, because if you go in the first-tier cities, in the suburbs of Shanghai, of Chongqing, even Chengdu, you hear that actually a lot of things are possible now. That the hukou, in fact, is not really there anymore, because they can buy houses apparently. Social security is less evident, but the schooling system is an issue, because you either have your kids or you don't have your kids. If you have your kids, they don't go in premium schools.
Yeah.
So the question is here, what is actually new about the hukou? Because I'm told there's nothing really new, because it was previously in strategic documents, and on the other hand, it's being tested everywhere. And then the second real question is about the retirement age, because you say social security, retirement age is one, and it's related to demography. So what does the resolution say? The resolution says we will increase gradually the retirement age on a voluntary basis. So everyone is wondering, what does it actually mean? And we feel very much, and it makes a lot of sense that the leadership is cautious, because this is very sensitive. It's sensitive in Belgium. The government decided that I will retire not at 65 but at 67, and later on they will. We did it in Belgium, by the way. Not a lot of questions asked. I understand it's very sensitive, but the question is what will actually happen on retirement age. And the third one is for Professor Tu, because you said yes, there's language on unifying the market, and yes, it's surprising to see the impediments that there are to a full-fledged single market in China. But I'm also told that this language has been taken already, and this objective has been put in many strategic documents before. So my question is, what's actually new? Sorry to tease you a little bit for the sake of discussion.
Let me try first your question about the hukou and the social welfare benefit. The first point I want to say is that even the resolution, which is much more in detail, is still a policy document. And now the 300 items are distributed to different government departments. They're forming working groups and putting together the concrete measures. We probably have to wait for a little while. So we don't exactly know yet, but I can tell you my speculation, why this time it's different. The hukou system started to become a bit more flexible during the last few years. But the main constraint really was the local government budget. Because if you want to settle down a migrant worker, you need to offer them the kind of social welfare benefit, and the local government need to foot the bill. That's why it was difficult in some areas when the local government really had a very tight budget. My guess is that the central government is going to play some role in this area. What specifically, I don't know yet. The kind of, like what kind of portion or what specific items. But the overall idea about the fiscal reform, the government already said, they're going to centralize some of the spending responsibilities. And they're going to centrally manage whatever fundraising was conducted, as long as they are supported by administrative power, local government, credit, and so on. They need to manage and integrate the budget, which probably means the central government will need to play a greater role. That's the idea, and I think it is different. What was the second question? On retirement age, I don't know exactly, but the speculation is that we're probably going to postpone the retirement age like every 3 or 5 years. So for instance, at the moment, if this is 60, in 3 years it could be 61 or 62. That's the idea. I think there is already a consensus among experts and policymakers. But you're right, there was no specific number.
Yes, a final question for Professor Wang before he has to be excused. Yes, I'm asking.
Thank you very much, President and Professor Wang, for a wonderful presentation. As an African diplomat, I just wanted to hear from you, Prof. As you know, in the next few weeks we'll be having the next FOCA summit, where heads of state from Africa will be meeting with their counterpart, the host, the Executive President Xi, to discuss strategic partnership in different areas.
Yes.
And I want to know the current reforms that are being talked about. Where do you see Africa benefiting from the current reforms? Because, as you know, many experts have talked about 3 paradoxes in Africa. The energy paradox, despite the fact that we have a huge potential, more than 10 million megawatts of solar potential, we have 350,000 gigawatts of hydro, and we have resources for new energy, vehicles, and industrialization is still at the lowest stage. For us, we are not presenting ourselves in any market as people who want to be supportive, but as a continent that has a huge market of 1.3 billion people, the continent that possesses everything. If we talk about food security, for instance, 60% of world Arab land is found on the African continent. Yet, many countries are faced with the food shortage. But I think the solution should not be, buying, food products or cultural products from Africa, but invest in agriculture to increase productivity, as we mentioned earlier.
Yes.
So where do you find Africa, and how does Africa benefit from the current reforms, taking into account the fact that this can be win-win cooperation that will impact on the growth of Chinese economy, but also support Africa's growth, especially the fact that for the first time in the history of Africa, we have become one market. And in January 2021, Africa, the entire African continent, decided to be one market under Africa Continental Trade Area, and this is a huge potential for Chinese companies and enterprises. So I wanted to see whether these reforms are also intended, because I remember a few years back, I think 2 years, you talked about the geo-separation strategy. What is the current status of that strategy, and how does it affect the growth of the African continent and China? Thank you.
This is a very important question, but it goes way beyond my expertise. Maybe Professor Chu would be in a better position to explain to you what the government has in mind. I will leave you 2 points, and then I'll step down. The first is, China has this Belt and Road Initiative. It's been doing quite a lot. There are successful stories and less successful stories. What I think that the government is also emphasizing is in addition to provide funding to support infrastructure and so on, there is a big effort also to provide knowledge, for instance. In fact, our school at the center, we have a parallel school, National School of Development, a parallel school called the South-South Institute of South-South Cooperation and Development. Every year we have dozens of students coming from developing countries, including lots of African students. In fact, the first PhD student I supervised was the Director General of the Office of the Vice President in Zimbabwe. So we try to provide some exchange and education to students from there. That's, I think, you could regard as the second phase of collaboration, not just providing financial support. The second point, which I'll share with you, this is my very wild imagination. Recently, when we were talking about the domestic overcapacity of the EVs, the new batteries, and the solar panels, and so on, at some stage, I proposed the idea of the so-called Global South Green Development Plan. It's a little bit like a Green Marshall Plan. I think China has domestic overcapacity problem in some areas. And obviously, the main destination, export destination, should be the advanced economy. But these economies are creating barriers for our exports. And my sense is it will be very difficult for the domestic market to absorb all these capacity unless you just disrupt some of the capacities. But I think the developing countries also require these products for their own green transition. And my suggestion is maybe the government can put together a new grand plan, like to raise the demand for domestic, the Chinese production, but also mitigate the overcapacity problem. This is a little bit wild, but just to share with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Huang. I understand Professor Huang has another very important event to attend, so let us give another round of warm applause to thank you for his speech and for his answers to our questions. I think we have many questions that eventually we probably will need to line up similar presentations for Professor Huang for us. Thank you. Yes. And now it gives me great pleasure to invite Professor Tu to go to the stage and answer all the questions from us. And I hope you will have more questions or more grilling questions for Professor Tu. 老黄再见.
Enjoy.
Thank you. Thank you. So the floor is open. Anyone who has questions about Mr. Tu. But before we start, let me try to give a short answer to Ambassador's question. I think from the Chinese perspective, when we look at Africa, several things stand out. One is maintaining stability for each of the countries and for the whole continent. Secondly, keeping peace. Try to avoid war of all kinds in Africa or in anywhere else. Thirdly, connectivity. Africa is probably one of the most fragmented continents in the world in terms of connectivity projects, so try your best to build up your connectivity. And then Africa has all the conditions to become a basket of food for mankind, rather than a continent of hunger. So you need to figure out how you can really leverage off of all the technologies, expertise in Africa and outside of Africa to make sure that agricultural production will really be increased significantly. We have scientists who focus on Africa to figure out how China and Africa can cooperate to boost agricultural production of all kinds for Africa. It is real time for Africa to become self-efficient, sufficient in food production, and eventually achieve the goal of being an exporting continent for agriculture. Then the final point is manufacturing. In China, we always say without industry or without manufacturing, you cannot really achieve wealth. So line up manufacturing. So these are my brief comments, but we'll be happy to share more views. So Professor Tu, any questions for Professor Tu? Thank you. No questions?
No, that's good.
Yes, Ambassador, please.
Thank you very much for this opportunity, and thank you for CCG for hosting this wonderful event. In your presentation, Professor, you focused on several important aspects of development and also the restrictions. You mentioned control. There is too much control, too many restrictions in different spheres, from economic regulation to academy and so on and so forth. How do you see this developing? You indicated that in the document this issue, Wally, has been mentioned a number of times. Which restrictions, in which areas, and in which way, in your view, are going to be mitigated, lifted, abolished, and also what impact does it have for a wider sort of dynamic in this society and in this country? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. In recent trade policy review on China, there were always more than 2,000 questions raised by members. There will be so many questions to me. And your question is also very difficult. Actually, as I said, there were some restrictions or control over the society. And also there are some complaints, actually, for us, like professors and academia persons. For example, in the after 2013, they had some restrictions for our overseas visits. So even for professors, we also have a kind of a regulation that only like 5 days for one country, 8 days for 2 countries, something like that. So there were some complaints. But after a few years, this restriction has been cancelled. Because, as I said, there were a lot of complaints. And we found that this is not good for China, especially to expand our international influence or international exposure. Because, as I said, the professors are facing restrictions to go overseas to communicate with other countries, with other also academia communities. So then, gradually, this problem has been raised to be reflected to the relevant authorities. They find this problem. So the restriction has been cancelled. And also in other areas, as a professor, we also faced a lot of financial restrictions to use our research fund. There were a lot of restrictions. It was very difficult for us to use our own research fund. And also, after a while, the government noticed it. So, under the direct leadership of former Premier Li Keqiang, new regulations were adopted. Now it is much easier for us. So, of course, there will be problems emerging. So then, after a while, we will find a solution to deal with the problem. So actually, as I said, there have been some restrictions and which have been found inappropriate and bad for us. So the government will take new measures to deal with it. So of course, right now there are still some restrictions. Even like during the pandemic, universities established some entrance registration requirements. Right now, some universities are still using it. So if you are going to enter our campus, you need to register in advance and scan some cards or whatever. So I think there's kind of how to say continuity, I mean, from the older the past restrictions. So as I said, I think we need more resolutions to deal with those restrictions. Again, for the government, of course, the stability or security is very important priority. But you need to find, you need to strike a balance. So I think we need to deal with those problems one by one. Maybe some will be more difficult, but some will be easier to deal with.
Thank you very much. We have another ambassador. I have a question over there.
Thank you very much. I want to join in thanking CCG for this excellent presentations of the two speakers. It's been very good and very clear expose of the conclusions of the third plenum. Difficult, evidently, for us to digest the whole document, and therefore useful to have this. One of the emphasis of the Chinese leadership has been on speaking to importation and making it clear to importers to China that China is open for importation of foreign goods, and there's been interest in the leadership of facilitating that importation even further. I'm wondering whether that is being addressed in any of these 300 reform points. More specifically, 1.5 years ago, China introduced a new registration system for importation of goods that has proven to be extremely difficult for exporters to China because of complexities and bureaucratic confusions. Is there any attempt in the conclusion of these 300 proposals to address these issues? Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you for the question. I didn't know about the registration requirement you mentioned. But basically, I think, as I also mentioned, in the last years, China has been working hard to promote unilateral liberalization. The current average tariff is already below China's commitment to the WTO. It's like almost 7%. It's lower than the 10% our Chinese WTO commitment. And also in terms of trade facilitation, we also have reduced very much on the clearing hours at the border, at the customs. So basically, I would say China has made a lot of progress in terms of trade liberalization and facilitation. But of course, also as you mentioned, maybe the more important issue is maybe not border measures, but some regulatory measures. So we consider it as a so-called, as I said, institutional openness. So I think, in my opinion, China should learn more from the advanced countries in terms of their better practices in terms of regulations in different areas. As I mentioned also, a number of areas, legal protection or environmental protection, and also maybe the registration requirement mentioned is about maybe STS or TBT. That's also actually about regulatory coherence. The WTO, of course, has already two agreements on those technical requirements, technical regulations. So, yeah, I mean, of course, if you really have a very significant problem, as I said, the WTO already has provided a platform to discuss those issues. So again, as I said, sometimes there will be some conflicting policy purposes. So for some government agencies, they will have their own priority. But sometimes it will conflict with other purposes of other government agencies. So like MOFCOM will promote trade liberalization and facilitation, or maybe SASAC or anyway, other agencies will have their own priority. Sometimes there will be conflict with each other. So we need more internal policy coordination. Actually, the document also mentioned, especially in the macroeconomic policies, we need some, as I said, policy coherence between different policies. So, yeah, as I said, we need more coordination in this sense.
Thank you. Any other questions, please? Yes, please. Gentleman over there in the back.
Thank you. Excuse me. Professor Tu, you mentioned the omission of the dominant role of public ownership. So if public ownership, if state-owned enterprises are not going to have a dominant role, what role do you see them playing in the economy? Would love to hear your opinion.
Thank you. As you know, China is a socialist country and a socialist market economy. So basically, we will believe that public ownership is a critical feature of this system. So as I said, this kind of omission is very, very meaningful. But then you mentioned what role should SOEs play or public ownership should play. I very much agree with Professor Huang about the role of SOEs in the Chinese economy. I believe SOEs as the state sector should and could play a very important role, especially in providing public utilities and also social and economic stability. I think also this is all one advantage of China's economic system, because SOEs are controlled by the government, and the government could use it for many, actually, I believe it would be many social purposes. And also, as mentioned by Professor Huang, there is also a very significant problem of inequality in China. But the public sector or the state sector right now is already playing a very important role in this sense. Like right now, hospitals in China, hospitals are mainly public owned. I think the Chinese hospital system has provided very at least affordable and not maybe not so perfect, but a good service, health service to the general public. As I said, I come from Zhejiang province, also from a small village. Now my parents can enjoy the public health system. So as I said, for relatively poor people, they can enjoy a relatively good health service. If the health system is also private, I would say the cost will be much higher. So I still believe that the state sector could play a very positive role in providing those public goods.
Thank you. Allow me to add a personal observation. I think the Third Plenum has made its kind of decision on the SOEs versus the private-owned enterprises for China for the coming few years or decades. But allow me to share with you my dream. I hope one day in China there will be no more distinctions between the state-owned enterprises or the private-owned enterprises or foreign-invested enterprises. So long as the enterprises are incorporated in China, they should enjoy equal treatment, in terms of law, access to financing, labor forces, etc. But when that will happen, I do not know. But I think it will be a much better way. For example, if you want to take a flight with Cathay Pacific versus Singapore Airlines, you do not first ask which one is state-owned, which one is a private commercial airline. I think you will more focus on the quality of the service, your membership, for example, benefits, and safety records, etc. I think China is moving in that direction, but it's slow. It's slow. And I'm personally a little bit disappointed by so much emphasis on the state-owned enterprises. And while I also highly appreciate the government's continued emphasis on promoting private-owned enterprises, to such an extent that you may know that in the all-powerful NDRC, there is a new bureau called the Private Enterprise Promotion Bureau. Well, this is exactly what the private enterprises are concerned about. They do not want to be called private-owned enterprises. They do not want to have a bureau to take care of their businesses. They just want it to be equal with the SOEs. They want to have equal treatment, equal access. They do not want to be singled out as a private enterprise versus a state-owned enterprise. But I think Mr. Tu and Professor Huang are absolutely right that in China, for whatever reason, just keep in mind, end of the 1970s, SOEs were up to 100% in the national economy. Now it's way down as a percentage. And going forward, I think private enterprises will continue to play a more important role. But I think to have this kind of carved in stone separation between the SOEs versus the private enterprises and then foreign invested enterprises in China probably will be considered very artificial if, let's say, looking back 10 years or 20 years later at what China will have. It will be a much better way to do business. Enterprises will be given complete equal access to all the resources and production factors. But that's my personal observation. Any other question? Yes, the madam over there. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Xianhe Hall. I'm with the German business daily Handelsblatt, the Warschau. One of the biggest issues of the Chinese economy is the real estate crisis, which also holds back household consumption. Do you think that this problem is sufficiently addressed in the resolution and with the urgency needed? And the second question would be, there is a new year mentioned in the resolution, 2029, which I don't think has been around before, until when the measures should be implemented. Do you think this creates a new urgency, or how can we interpret this year?
Actually, the current difficulties in the real estate market, well, partly actually due to some maybe excessive policy interventions. The intention of the government is to actually to transfer the resources in the real estate industry to other more productive industries, especially manufacturing industries. So I think the purpose, the intention is right. But the problem is in China especially, and also as mentioned by Professor Huang, we have a low share of consumption. Chinese people's consumption is largely related to the housing, to houses or apartments. Chinese people are very good at saving, not good at consuming. But we would like to consume, spend money on the house. But when the housing market declines, then our consumption also declines. So, in my opinion, we have some, maybe we didn't expect the impact of the kind of the decline of the housing market on consumption. So it is really urgent. I think it is really urgent to deal with this crisis. I'm not sure, but I'm not sure whether this document has provided a clear solution to that, because the housing market is still declining. It will take a while, I think. For now, the government has taken a number of measures to try to stop the decline, but it's not so easy. Thank you.
Thank you. One final question for Professor Tu. Yes, that gentleman.
Thank you, Professor Tu. I know you are an expert on trade policy and WTO, so my question about that. From the document of Third Plenary, it mentioned China will take institutional opening up and will change the rules of subsidy, IPR protection, and environmental protection, subsidy, and labor protection, etc. So does it mean China will follow the rules of CPTPP? And could you give an update on China's accession negotiation to CPTPP? Do you really think China will revise the domestic rules to follow the standards of CPTPP? You know, CPTPP is much higher international rules. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, this belongs to my expertise. Thank you. Well, CPTPP, as you know, China has applied to join CPTPP. But for now, as I know, there's very little progress. It's very difficult for China to join it because there are different understandings about this issue among the members, the existing members. And also there are some political difficulties. So for now, I would say it's a very, at least it's not possible for now to join us. But actually, in recent years, many local governments have tried hard to take CPTPP rules as benchmark for their own reform and opening up. So in this sense, I think that China does not need to join the CPTPP to do as CPTPP requires. So we can do it ourselves. Basically, CPTPP rules are about, as I said, institutional reforms, not about market access. Of course, there are some, but not so much about market access. So you can do it unilaterally or by yourself. So as I mentioned, the resolution of the decision has listed those areas we can promote by ourselves. And many of them are related to CPTPP rules. Not all of them, but some of them. So in this sense, I think the Chinese institutional opening up could go beyond CPTPP rules. We should follow, as I said, the best practices of other countries, not only international rules, but also other countries' best practices. So we should learn from others to make ourselves even better.